A mom accused of beating her teenage son to death pleaded not guilty. 29-year-old Denaya Young is charged with second-degree murder.
1,172 separate injuries, each mark telling the story of unimaginable suffering inflicted on a 14-year-old boy, not by a stranger or a criminal, but by his own mother. For 3 hours, Denaya Young, 29, repeatedly struck her teenage son with an HDMI cord, a common household item transformed into a deadly weapon. The beating was so severe that medical examiners later struggled to count the individual wounds covering his head, neck, ears, torso, arms, and legs. The reason for this fatal assault? Household chores left undone. In January of 2023, Seattle police responded to a distressing 911 call from a mother claiming her son had become unresponsive during what she described as spanking. When authorities arrived at the family home, they discovered a scene that defied the sanitized description provided by the caller. The teenager was rushed to the hospital, but couldn't be saved. What began as punishment had escalated into something far deadlier. The case shocked the local community and raised disturbing questions about the line between discipline and abuse. Inside the household, 3 younger siblings had been present during the prolonged assault. The boy's stepfather was also home. Yet for hours, no one intervened as Young repeatedly struck her son until he collapsed. In police interviews, she would later admit she lost count of how many times she hit him with the cord, continuing even as he pleaded for her to stop and complained of dizziness. Stay with me as we examine how this tragedy unfolded and identify the critical warning signs everyone should recognize. Understanding these red flags could help save a child's life. What pushes a parent beyond reasonable discipline? And what can we learn to prevent similar tragedies in our communities? Denaya Young was a 29-year-old mother living in Seattle, Washington. Before January 30th, 2023, she had no significant criminal history that would have flagged her as a potential threat to her children. Her 14-year-old son, whose name has been withheld from public records to protect his dignity, was the oldest of her 4 children. According to school records and neighbor accounts, he was described as a quiet, respectful teenager who largely kept to himself. The relationship between Young and her eldest son appeared normal to outside observers. There were no previous reports to Child Protective Services that might have indicated ongoing abuse. Friends and acquaintances expressed shock when the news broke, stating they had never witnessed any weird behavior from Young toward any of her children. This disconnect between public perception and private reality would later become a crucial element in understanding how this tragedy could occur without earlier intervention. The household consisted of Young, her current husband, the boy's stepfather, and 4 children, the 14-year-old victim and 3 younger half-siblings. They lived in a modest home in Seattle, where neighbors described them as relatively private, but not unusually so. The stepfather had been in the family's life for several years, though his relationship with his stepson remained somewhat unclear from available information. Financial pressures appeared to be a factor in the household, with Young reportedly working long hours while maintaining strict expectations about home maintenance and chores. The responsibility for many household duties fell to the oldest child, creating a dynamic where he was expected to take on adult-like responsibilities. This arrangement is not uncommon in families where parents work demanding schedules, but in this case, it created a pressure cooker situation where incomplete chores became the trigger for catastrophic violence. The younger children were reportedly assigned fewer responsibilities due to their age. In the weeks before the fatal beating, tensions had been building in the Young household. According to statements later made to investigators, Young had been increasingly frustrated with what she perceived as her oldest son's failure to complete his assigned chores to her standards. Text messages recovered from Young's phone showed multiple warnings and threats of punishment if the kitchen and other areas weren't properly cleaned. The day before the incident, Young had reportedly worked a double shift and returned home to find household tasks incomplete. She had sent her son to bed with a warning that he would need to finish everything the following day. On the morning of January 30th, before leaving for work, she left a detailed list of chores that needed to be completed by the time she returned home. When Young arrived home that afternoon, she immediately inspected the kitchen and other areas of the house. finding the chores still incomplete or not done to her standards. She became enraged. According to her later confession to police, she retrieved an HDMI cord and called her son into the living room. What began as verbal reprimanding quickly escalated to physical punishment. The stepfather was home but remained in another room with the younger children, later claiming he was unaware of the severity of what was happening. This critical failure to intervene would allow the situation to escalate from punishment to deadly abuse over the next 3 hours. On January 30th, 2023, the day began like many others in the Young household. Denaya Young left for work in the morning after reminding her 14-year-old son about his chores. The teenager was home with his stepfather and 3 younger siblings. According to later police reports, the boy spent most of the day in his room, emerging occasionally to attempt the cleaning tasks his mother had assigned. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Young returned home and immediately inspected the kitchen. Finding it below her standards, she became visibly angry. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices from the home shortly after 1:15. By 1:30, Young had retrieved an HDMI cord and begun what she would later describe to police as disciplining her son. The beating continued, with brief interruptions, for approximately 3 hours. During this time, the stepfather remained in the home with the younger children, but claimed he was unaware of the severity of the situation. At approximately 2:10 in the afternoon, the teenager collapsed after being pushed against a wall. Instead of immediately calling for help, Young continued the assault intermittently for several more minutes. It wasn't until around 2:15, when she noticed her son was unresponsive, that she finally called 911. Emergency services arrived within minutes, but by then, the boy's condition was critical. According to Young's own statements to investigators, the beating began with her striking her son repeatedly with an HDMI cord across his back, legs, and arms. When questioned about the duration and intensity of the assault, Young admitted she had lost count of how many times she hit him. "I just kept swinging the cord," she told detectives. "I should have listened, but I kept saying you're going to stand up and do your chores."
Court documents show Young called 911 on January 30th to report she got into an altercation with her son and he was unresponsive. She reportedly told Seattle police she was spanking him with an extension cord because he didn't do his chores. The 14-year-old was taken to Harborview, where he later died. Young is being held on a $3 million bail.
The most disturbing aspect of Young's confession was her acknowledgement that her son had verbally expressed distress during the beating. He was like, "Mom, I'm dizzy. I can't do it." And I thought he was faking, she stated. Despite these pleas, she continued the assault. At one point, she shoved him against a wall, causing him to hit his head. He then went limp and fell to the floor. Even after the teenager collapsed, Young did not immediately seek medical attention. According to the police report, she waited approximately 5 minutes before calling emergency services. During this critical time, the boy's condition deteriorated rapidly. When she finally called 911, she downplayed the situation, describing it as the teen becoming unresponsive during a spanking. In her later interviews with police, Young seemed to recognize the enormity of her actions, telling detectives, "I went too far." She explained that her anger had escalated when she perceived her son as being defiant or making excuses. The stepfather, when questioned, claimed he had heard what he thought was normal discipline, but had not witnessed the severity of the beating or seen the boy's condition until after the 911 call was made. The medical examiner's report revealed the truly horrific extent of the abuse. The 14-year-old had suffered 1,172 distinct injuries across his body. These injuries covered his head, neck, ears, torso, arms, and legs, essentially every accessible part of his body. The pattern and distribution of the wounds were consistent with being repeatedly struck with a cord-like object. The cause of death was determined to be sudden inflammatory response syndrome, a condition where the body sends too much blood to multiple injury sites, ultimately preventing adequate blood flow to the heart. In essence, the sheer number and extent of injuries overwhelmed the teenager's body's ability to respond to the trauma. The medical examiner noted that while any single strike might not have been fatal, the cumulative effect of hundreds of blows over 3 hours created a situation where survival became impossible. The report also indicated that prompt medical attention immediately after the boy collapsed might have increased his chances of survival. At approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, Denaya Young finally placed a call to emergency services. The recording reveals her describing the situation as her son becoming unresponsive during a spanking, a severe understatement of what had actually occurred. First responders arrived within minutes to find the 14-year-old unconscious and in critical condition. Paramedics immediately began life-saving measures and rushed him to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. Despite the medical team's intensive efforts, the teenager's injuries were too extensive and numerous. Hospital staff pronounced him dead shortly after arrival, triggering an immediate police investigation into the circumstances surrounding his death. Seattle Police Department detectives arrived at the hospital and began interviewing Young about the events leading to her son's death. As the inconsistencies in her story became apparent and the extent of the boy's injuries became clear, investigators shifted from treating the case as a tragic accident to a potential homicide. Young was taken into custody that same evening. On January 31st, 2023, just one day after her son's death, Young was booked into King County Jail on suspicion of murder. The King County Prosecutor's Office worked quickly to build their case, reviewing the medical examiner's findings, witness statements, and Young's own admissions. By February 5th, prosecutors formally charged Young with second-degree murder, citing the extreme nature of the beating and her failure to promptly seek medical attention when her son collapsed. The charging document specifically noted that the assault happened over an hour on a 14-year-old child and included details about her continuing to beat him after he lost consciousness. Young's first court appearance on February 1st was notable for her refusal to appear before the judge. Her public defender, Zelina Jones, appeared on her behalf and made an unusual argument for her client's release, stating, "This involves a mother losing her son and significant trauma she is experiencing from that. I'd also argue there would be additional trauma on top of that if she is incarcerated." The judge was unmoved by this reasoning and sided with prosecutors who requested bail be set at $3 million, citing the extreme violence of the crime and potential risk to Young's other children. During subsequent hearings, Young appeared withdrawn and emotionally flat. According to courtroom observers, the court ordered psychological evaluations and appointed guardians for Young's 3 remaining children, who were placed in protective custody pending further investigation into their home environment and potential previous abuse. Child welfare officials began interviewing the siblings to determine if they too had experienced similar treatment. What drives a parent to such extreme violence? How does discipline cross the line into deadly abuse? This case raises profound questions about parental rage and control. Share your thoughts in the comments below on warning signs society should recognize, and let's discuss how communities can better protect vulnerable children. The case of Denaya Young exemplifies how parental discipline can catastrophically escalate when fueled by rage and a perceived loss of control. Psychologists who study family violence point to several factors that can transform ordinary punishment into deadly abuse. First is the concept of discipline escalation. When initial attempts at correction don't produce the desired results, some parents intensify punishment rather than trying different approaches. This escalation often occurs alongside what experts call parental attribution error, interpreting a child's behavior as deliberately defiant rather than considering alternative explanations like developmental limitations, misunderstanding, or genuine inability. Young's statement that she thought her son was faking his dizziness reveals this dangerous misattribution. She interpreted his physical distress as manipulation, which further fueled her rage. Another critical factor is emotional regulation failure. Parents who resort to extreme physical punishment often lack effective strategies for managing their own emotions. When Young returned home to find chores incomplete, her frustration likely triggered a stress response that overwhelmed her rational thinking. Without adequate coping mechanisms, this emotional flooding led to impulsive, uncontrolled violence that continued even as her son showed clear signs of distress. The 3-hour duration suggests a prolonged state of rage where normal empathetic responses and protective parental instincts were completely overridden. Excessive punishment often stems from deeply ingrained beliefs about authority, obedience, and parenting. Some individuals raised in households where severe physical discipline was normalized may reproduce these patterns without questioning their appropriateness or potential harm. Research shows that parents who employ extreme punishment typically hold rigid beliefs about child compliance and parental authority.
Mary, a defense attorney, went as far today as asking a judge to release this woman from custody, saying she's dealing with the trauma of the loss of her son, the same son who she is accused of beating to death for not doing his chores. There's a broken window at the home where police say a mother killed her 14-year-old son. A jail report says the woman told investigators her son did not complete his chores and she was angry. After an hour of beating the boy, police say he went unresponsive and the woman waited 5 minutes before calling 911. The boy went to the hospital where he died. The mother was booked into jail for murder.
Is Young, is she intending to come out? Oh, no, Your Honor.
At a bail hearing Friday afternoon, the mother refused to appear in court. Despite that, her public defender argued for her to be released from custody.
Given her limited history and the fact that it appears that she cooperated with law enforcement and the fact that she has very limited resources, I believe she should be released.
The defense attorney said the woman is in grief at the loss of the son she is accused of killing.
I acknowledge the seriousness of these facts, but this also involves a mother losing her son and significant trauma she's experiencing from that. I also argue there'll be additional trauma on top of that if she's incarcerated.
Police outlined the disturbing attack in a report, saying the woman mercilessly beat her child for an hour, including using an extension cord to spank him.
This assault happened over an hour. A 14-year-old child, extension cords. He struck his head, he lost consciousness, and she continued to beat him, and then failed to call for emergency services.
Neighbors we spoke to said they didn't know the family well and they hadn't seen any issues at the home until now. So we're not naming the woman yet because she hasn't been charged. Prosecutors say they expect that to happen by next Tuesday. For now, the judge set bail at $3 million and the woman remains here at King County Jail. Reporting live in Seattle, Jeremy Harris, Como News.
Control is another crucial psychological element. When parents feel their authority is challenged or their control is threatened, some respond with escalating force to reassert dominance. This dynamic is particularly dangerous when combined with external stressors like financial pressure, work demands, or relationship difficulties, all factors that may have been present in Young's life. Perhaps most concerning is the psychological disconnect that allows a parent to continue inflicting harm despite a child's obvious suffering. This requires a temporary suspension of empathy and attachment, a psychological state where enforcing compliance becomes more important than protecting one's child from harm. This dissociation from normal parental protective instincts represents one of the most dangerous aspects of abusive discipline. The tragic death of Young's son represents one case in a disturbing national pattern. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, approximately 1,750 children die from abuse and neglect annually in the United States. Of these fatalities, nearly 70% involve children under the age of 4, making the death of a teenager like Young's son somewhat less common, but no less tragic. Parents are the perpetrators in over 78% of child abuse fatalities, with mothers acting alone responsible for approximately 30% of these deaths. Most alarming is that in nearly half of fatal child abuse cases, the family was already known to Child Protective Services. The United States maintains a complex legal landscape regarding physical discipline. While all 50 states prohibit child abuse, 19 states still permit corporal punishment in schools, and no state completely bans physical discipline by parents. This creates a gray area where the line between legal discipline and criminal abuse often depends on severity, injury, and intent. Countries including Sweden, Spain, and New Zealand have implemented complete bans on all corporal punishment, including by parents. Research consistently shows that physical punishment is associated with increased aggression, antisocial behavior, and mental health problems in children, regardless of whether it meets the legal threshold for abuse. These findings have led the American Academy of Pediatrics to recommend against all forms of corporal punishment. Recognizing when discipline becomes abuse is crucial for intervention. Warning signs include punishment that leaves marks or injuries, discipline driven by parental anger rather than teaching, punishment disproportionate to a child's age or the situation, using objects like belts, cords, or wooden implements, and discipline that instills fear rather than understanding. Other red flags include isolation, where punishment happens behind closed doors, inconsistent rules where children cannot predict what will trigger punishment, and when children show fear around normal activities or mistakes. Perhaps most concerning is when a parent seems unable to stop punishing even when a child is clearly distressed. Exactly what happened in the Young case. The death of this 14-year-old boy represents a profound failure of protection. 1,172 injuries tell a story not just of one family's tragedy, but of society's ongoing struggle to define boundaries of discipline, recognize warning signs, and intervene before abuse turns fatal. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to help spread awareness. Your engagement helps us reach more people with these important messages. Together, we can work toward a world where children are disciplined with guidance and love, not violence and fear.